to Psalm 23. We're in verse 4. A life of His presence. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for Thou art with me. For Thou art with me. Wonderful words. Again, this fourth verse shows us that the circumstances of life, whether positive or adverse, should not be what defines or shapes our character, but we are to rise above those things. We see here that the psalmist not only states the inevitability of the valley, but also the blessed personal experience in that valley, which is the presence of the Lord. We see God, as we've looked at His omnipresence, He's in all places at the same time. That is, presently, He's in the past. Presently, He's in the present. Presently, He's in the future. And again, that includes all places in the past, all places in the present, all places in the future, always, everywhere present, in place and time, and wherever He is God. Wherever He is, and He's everywhere, He is who He is. He is God. Psalm 139, verse 8, the psalmist said, if I, no matter where I go, he says, Thou art. Thou art. Thou art there. Thou art there. Doesn't matter where we go. Thou art there. Whether we ascend all the way to heaven or all the way into the depths of hell and everything in between, He is there. Always, everywhere, God. But the psalmist here, what he's speaking of in Psalm 23:4, it includes the omnipresence of God, no doubt. It's a part of it. But he's speaking of the gracious presence of God. And it's very personal. He says, Thou art with me. Thou art with me. Has a tone of certainty about it. Thou art with me. He's very assured. Thou art with me. The one who can strengthen and lift us up, and who can guide us through the maze of life, and who is the solution to whatever the problem is, and who can carry us, and who can bear the load, and who can calm the storm. The psalmist says, Thou art with me. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. Not a place that we choose to be. It's not our preference by any means. But Thou art there. Thou art with me. So this is God's presence for us. It is God's presence for us. There's the omnipresence of God. God is everywhere. But this is God's presence for us. God's gracious presence. Again, it's a branch of the omnipresence of God. It is the presence of relationship. It is the presence of friendship. It is the presence of acceptance. It is the presence of favor. It is His communing presence. Thou art with me. Again, it is the infinite God for us, for the finite. It is the sovereign ruler of all, for His subjects, on behalf of His subjects. It is the Almighty for our weakness. It is the omniscient one for our ignorance. It is the all-sufficient one for our poverty and our need. Again, it is God's provision of Himself. Thou art with me. God providing Himself for me. This is the gracious presence of the Lord. And you and I can live life enjoying and knowing that presence. God Himself, God's provision of Himself. God in our dwelling, has our refuge, has our abiding place, has our fortress. So thou art with me. It is God available to us. It is God accessible to us. It is the reality of the protecting, loving, caring, sustaining presence of God. Thou art with me. And we ought to be able to live our lives and be able to say with great assurance and great confidence, Thou art with me. That changes everything. That changes all places. That changes all times. Thou art with me. Makes all the difference. So let's consider. We looked last week at the gracious presence of the Lord presented from the negative. Tonight we want to consider it from the positive aspect. God is said to dwell in certain places. Okay, we've already established that God is omnipresent. He's everywhere present at the same time. But yet the Bible states that God is in specific places. And I believe when it states that, it simply means He's there in a different way. It's His gracious presence. And even His gracious presence is in specific places. You can expect to find it there. Notice in Psalm 9 in verse 11. Psalm 9, verse 11. Sing praises to the Lord which dwelleth in Zion. Okay, that was Jerusalem in the Old Testament. That was the place of worship in the Old Testament. He dwells there. That is, it's a special place. It's a special place of His dwelling. We see the same thing in Psalm 26, verse 8, again Psalm 76, verse 2, Psalm 135, verse 21. God is in the Old Testament in that place of worship. Now in Matthew chapter 18, speaking of His church, Matthew 18, verse 20, He says, For where two or three are gathered together in my name, that's His authority, there am I. There am I. He's everywhere. His omnipresence is everywhere. But this is something special. There am I in the midst of them. Matthew 28, of course, the Great Commission, He promises to be with His church. We see that this presence, this gracious presence of God, was experienced by many. We see that it was promised to many as a way to encourage them. We see it in Isaac. If we turn over to Genesis 26 and verse 3, Genesis 26, verse 3, he says, "Sojourn in this land, and I will be with thee." That is, in a very special way. I am everywhere, but I'll be with thee in a special way. And will bless thee. For unto thee and unto thy seed I will give all these countries, and I will perform the oath which I swear unto Abraham thy father, and I will make thy seed to multiply. And again, you just go on and on. I will, I will, I will. I will be with thee. And as I am with thee, I will. I will do this, and I will do that. He's there for Isaac. He's there on behalf of Isaac. Notice Genesis 26, verse 24. "And the Lord appeared unto him the same night, and said, I am the God of Abraham thy father. Fear not, for I am with thee, and will bless thee, and multiply thy seed for my servant Abraham's sake." We see as a result, Isaac built an altar. That is, it drove him to worship the Lord. Just the thought of God being with him caused him to worship the Lord. We see God promised to be with Jacob. Notice in Genesis 28. Genesis 28 and verse 15. "And behold, I am with thee, and will keep thee in all places whither thou goest, and will bring thee again into this land. For I will not leave thee until I have done that which I have spoken to thee of." I am with thee. And again, you see it's in a positive way, in a gracious way. God would do things for him. I am with thee to do for you. And when David says, "Thou art with me," that's the presence he is speaking of. God's gracious presence. We see with Moses. Notice in Exodus chapter 3. Exodus chapter 3. Verse 12. "And he said, Certainly I will be with thee. Certainly I will be with thee." That is, you can depend upon it, Moses. You can depend, you can be certain of it. I will be with thee. Exodus 33, verse 14. Exodus 33, verse 14. Again speaking to Moses, "And he said, My presence shall go with thee, and I will give thee rest. And he said unto him," Moses speaking to God now, "If thy presence go not with me, carry us not up hence." And then in verse 16, "For wherein shall it be known here that I and thy people have found grace in thy sight? Is it not that thou goest with us?" We know that we found grace in his sight when he goes with us. And that's what Moses is saying. He's saying, we're not going to go forward unless we know that you are going with us. That is a special, gracious presence of the Lord. In Deuteronomy chapter 31, again speaking to Moses. Deuteronomy 31 and verse 6. Deuteronomy 31 verse 6. "Be strong and of good courage. Fear not, nor be afraid of them. For the Lord thy God, He it is." The Lord thy God, He it is. He it is that doth go with thee. He, the Lord thy God, will not fail thee. He goes with thee. As He does, He will not fail thee. He will not forsake thee. So Moses could go forth with great confidence and great assurance. We see this promise is given to Israel, to the people of God in Exodus 29. Exodus 29, verse 45. And I will dwell among the children of Israel. I will dwell with them. I will abide with them. I will stay with them, and I will be their God. That is, my presence with them, I will be their God. We see the same thing in Leviticus 26, verse 12. Notice in Joshua chapter 1, we see God's promise to Joshua. Joshua has an awesome responsibility. And there shall not, in verse 5, there shall not any man be able to stand before thee all the days of thy life. As I was with Moses, so will I be with thee. I will not fail thee, nor forsake thee. God was with Joshua. We see the same thing in Joshua 3, verse 7. And the Lord said unto Joshua, this day will I begin to magnify thee in the sight of all Israel, that they may know that as I was with Moses, so I will be with thee. That was the assurance that Joshua could go forth with. That was the assurance that Joshua could carry out his ministry, was that God was with him. God was with him, and He's with us. He's with you and I. We see Gideon in the book of Judges, chapter 6, and verse 16. Judges 6, verse 16. And the Lord said unto him, surely I will be with thee, and thou shalt smite the Midianites as one man. You shall have victory. And the reason is, I will be with thee. The reason for the victory is, I am with you. We see God promised Hezekiah. Notice in 2 Kings 18. 2 Kings 18 and verse 7. 2 Kings 18, verse 7. And the Lord was with him, that is Hezekiah, and he prospered. Why? Because the Lord was with him. He prospered whithersoever he went forth. Because whithersoever he went forth, God was with him. And he prospered. And we see the same thing in 2 Chronicles 17, verses 3 through 5. Isaiah 45. He makes a promise to Cyrus. In Isaiah 45 and verse 2, he says, I will go before thee. I will go before thee and make the crooked places straight. Again, I will go with you, and when I do, I will do something. I will make the crooked places straight. You don't have to. I'll go with you, and I will do this. I will break in pieces the gates of brass and cut in sunder the bars of iron. And I will give thee the treasures of darkness. And once again, God would be with him, and I will. You don't have to do anything. I will do it. I will go with thee. And that's the assurance that you and I have today as well. It is the very presence that we read of in Isaiah 41 and verse 10. Isaiah 41, verse 10. Fear thou not, for I am with thee. Be not dismayed, for I am thy God. I will. There it is again. I am with you, and I will. He's not with us inactive, but He's always active and always on our behalf. I will strengthen thee. Yea, I will help thee. I will uphold thee with the right hand of my righteousness. Again, I am with thee. I am with thee. Notice in Isaiah 43, verse 2. When, not if, thou passest through the waters, I'll be with thee. And it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how deep the waters are. It doesn't matter how swift the waters are. He says, when thou passest through, when it's that time for you to pass through the waters, I will be with thee. And through the rivers, they shall not overflow thee. And why is that? Because I'll be with thee. When thou walkest through the fire, thou shalt not be burned, neither shall the flame kindle upon thee. You see, this is the gracious presence of God for us. Verse 5, fear not, for I am with thee. And once again, we have it. I will bring thy seed from the east and gather thee from the west. I will say to the north, give up. Once again, God is with us, and God is active, and God will. We see Jeremiah experienced this gracious presence of God. Notice in Jeremiah chapter 1 and verse 8. Jeremiah 1 and verse 8. Be not afraid of their faces, for I am with thee to deliver thee, saith the Lord. You see, in every case, I am with thee, and He's there for a purpose. I will. Here it is, I am with thee to deliver thee. He's not just with us just for the sake of keeping us company, but for a specific purpose. Notice verse 19. And they shall fight against thee, but they shall not prevail against thee. For I am with thee, saith the Lord, to deliver thee. In every case it's personal. Thee. Notice in Jeremiah 30, verse 11. Jeremiah chapter 30, verse 11. For I am with thee, saith the Lord. This is again speaking to Jeremiah. For a specific purpose. To save thee, though I make a full end of all nations. So once again, for I am with thee. I am. I continue to be with you. So we have this gracious presence of the Lord. And we can live in the reality of God's gracious presence. It's one thing to say, God's everywhere. Yes, He is. That's true. Do you feel His presence everywhere? We ought to. We ought to live in the awareness of His presence. And even if we can't feel His presence, we ought to know that He is present, because He said He would be. Now, living in the reality of God's presence, what does that mean? Well, when David said, Thou art with me, he could sense God's presence. He could sense a lot of things going through the valley of the shadow of death. But he could sense God's presence. He could see, I believe, God's presence. He could feel the reality. He could sense, he could see, he could feel the reality of the valley of the shadow of death. The valley of the shadow of death was very real. He could see it. He could feel it. He could sense it. But he could also sense and feel, Thou art with me. And that is more real than everything in the valley of the shadow of death. In Psalm 16, if we turn there, Psalm 16, in verse 8. This is a psalm of David. And he says, I have set the Lord always before me. I have set the Lord always before me. I believe what he's saying there is he's always aware that God is with him. Now, Peter, in Acts chapter 2:25, applies these words that we just read in Psalm 16:8 to Christ. I have set the Lord always before me. So Jesus is our example in living life, seeing, feeling, and experiencing the presence of God. Jesus, with the exception on the cross when he said, my God, why dost thou forsake me?" always saw the Father. Always saw the Father. And that's our duty. That's our privilege. To always see God. To always know He's there. He's there. He's there. Again, notice over in Psalm 139, we looked at these verses last week, but Psalm 139, verses 8 through 10. Again, this is a Psalm of David. If I ascend up into heaven, Thou art there. Thou art there. That is, if I can go as high as I can possibly go, God is there. If I make my bed in hell, if I can go to the greatest depths, behold, Thou art there. You notice when he says, if I ascend up into heaven, he just says, Thou art there. But when he says, if I make my bed in hell, if I go down to the deepest depths, then he says, behold. In other words, when you go as high as you can go, you expect God to be there. But when you go to the depths of hell, perhaps you don't. So he says, behold. Again, this is something amazing. Thou art there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there, so thy hand lead me, and thy right hand shall hold me. So you see, David was aware of the presence of God. And when we say living life in the presence of God, it means that we are aware of God's presence. It means that we actively welcome God into every area, every aspect and phase of our life. We welcome God into our life. We have a constant sense of His presence. We have an habitual acknowledgement of God. God's gracious presence. It's all encompassing. It's all encompassing. Again, we know the omnipresence of God is all encompassing. It's omni. But God's gracious presence, God there for us, God providing Himself for us. This presence is all-encompassing. It is presented in Scripture as being above us. So as you and I walk through life, God's presence is above us. Notice Hebrews chapter 9. Hebrews 9, verse 24. Hebrews 9, verse 24. For Christ has not entered into the holy places made with hands, which are the figures of the true, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us. God's presence is above us. God's presence is beside us. Notice in Psalm 16, again, Psalm 16:8, we read the first half of that verse. I have set the Lord always before me, because He is at my right hand. I shall not be moved. So God is above us. God is beside us. God goes before us. Notice John 10 and verse 4. And when He putteth forth His own sheep, He goeth before them, and the sheep follow Him, for they know His voice. So this gracious presence of God, God present for us, God present for our benefit. He's above us, He's beside us, He's in front of us, He is also behind us. Notice in Psalm 139, Psalm 139 and verse 5. Psalm 139, 5. Thou hast beset me behind and before, and laid thine hand upon me. So God's presence is above us. God's presence is beside us. God's presence goes before us. God's presence is behind us. God's presence is beneath us. We read in Deuteronomy 33:27, underneath are the everlasting arms. And then, of course, God is in us. Paul said in Galatians 2, verse 20, Christ liveth in me. 1 John 4 and verse 4, they that be with us are more than they that be with the world. Those that which is greater is in us than that which is in the world. So God is above us. God is beside us. God is before us. God is behind us. God is beneath us. God is in us. And David saw, he felt, he acknowledged this all-encompassing, gracious presence of God, even in the valley of the shadow of death. So when you and I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, we know that God is above us, He's beside us, He's in front of us, He's behind us, He's underneath, He's in us. It's the all-encompassing presence of God. And as you read this 23rd Psalm, living in the reality and personal experience of the Lord's gracious presence is expressed in every verse of the 23rd Psalm. He says, the Lord is my shepherd. A shepherd is not absent. A shepherd is present. He goes on to say, He maketh me. That's His presence. He leadeth me. He restoreth my soul. Thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me. Thou anointest my head with oil. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, which again shows that God is also behind us. So David feels this presence of God. And God's gracious presence with us speaks of the Lord's willingness toward us. God chooses to be with me. It speaks of His availability to us. We must not think of God as afar off, but as ever present, all-encompassing present. It speaks of His thoughtfulness toward us. It speaks of His care for us. It's something that we ought to long for. It's something that we ought to pray for every day. Lord, go with me. Lord, go with me. We need to pray that over and over and over. Lord, go with me. Go with me. We know His omnipresence is everywhere. It's with us. But we're talking about this special, gracious presence of God. Moses prayed for this presence. Notice in Exodus 33. Exodus 33. Begin reading with verse 15. And he said to him, we've already read this, if thy presence go not with me, carry us not up hence. He's praying. He's praying for God's presence there through verse 17. David longed for the presence of God. We've already seen that David has felt the presence of God. David longed for it in Psalm 63. Verses 1 and 2, he said, O God, Thou art my God, early will I seek Thee. My soul thirsteth for Thee. My flesh longeth for Thee in a dry and thirsty land where no water is, to see Thy power and Thy glory. He's talking about God's presence. To see Thy power and Thy glory, so as I have seen Thee in the sanctuary, where God is present. So he's praying, he's longing for the presence of God. We see in several places the psalmist prays for God's face to shine upon him. That's the presence of God. Notice Psalm 67:1, God be merciful unto us and bless us and cause His face to shine upon us. And we see the same thing in Psalm 80 verse 3, Psalm 80 verse 7, Psalm 80 verse 19. We ought to long for the presence of God. We ought to live in the reality of God's presence. We ought to live life experiencing the presence of God. Just as we can feel one another's presence, we can see one another's presence, we ought to be able to feel and sense the presence of God in our lives. And it changes our entire view of life. It changes how we view our circumstances when we know God is present. It may not be a set of circumstances that you and I would have ever chosen. There are a lot of circumstances that you and I, we're not going to choose. Given the choice, we're not going to choose those circumstances. But we ought to be able to sense God's presence. And even if we can't sense His presence, we ought to know He's there. Because He said He would be. Because He said He would be. And if we can't sense His presence, then we need to pray that God would cause us to sense His presence. This is where courage comes from. This is where assurance comes from. This is what strengthens hope, and on we could go. This was what revives the soul. The gracious presence of God. If God go with us, who can stand against us? There's no enemy too powerful if God go with us. And we must make sure that we don't get ahead of God. And that's what Moses is praying there in Exodus 33. So that we would live our life experiencing the presence of God every single day. That's our privilege. And it can happen every day. Ben, if you come and let's sing one verse of a song.